The courtroom erupted in a stunned silence as Judge Margaret Hayes, her silver hair trembling with fury, jabbed a trembling finger at the frail figure before her. "You dare deceive this court?" she thundered, her voice echoing off the wooden panels. Seated across from her was James "Jimmy" Carter, a 92-year-old WWII veteran in a faded army uniform, adorned with medals, his misty eyes fixed on the gavel in her hand. The crowd, mostly retirees with weathered faces, gasped, their hearts pounding as they witnessed the judge's rage. Jimmy clutched a tarnished medal, his silence a stark contrast to the storm around him. What secret lay buried in his past, and what mistake would the judge soon regret? The air crackled with anticipation. Don't miss the shocking truth about to unfold. The room, bathed in the soft glow of a June morning, was packed with onlookers, their murmurs a gentle hum beneath the tension. The wooden benches creaked as they leaned forward, many recalling their own days of service or loss, drawn to the drama unfolding before them. Jimmy sat still, his uniform a testament to a life of sacrifice, the ribbons and medals glinting faintly under the light. His hands, wrinkled and spotted with age, trembled slightly as they held the medal, a Purple Heart earned on the beaches of Normandy. The accusation against him was grave, fraudulently claiming veterans' benefits for decades. But the fire in the judge's eyes suggested something deeper, a personal wound driving her anger. Margaret Hayes, a woman in her late 60s with a reputation for unyielding justice, adjusted her glasses, her gaze piercing through the veteran. Her black robe seemed to swallow the light, mirroring the shadow cast by her own history. Her father, a soldier lost in the Korean War, whose memory fueled her distrust of those she deemed unworthy. The crowd sensed her passion, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably as they watched Jimmy's stoic demeanor. A man with a cane whispered to his wife, "He don't look like no cheat to me." The tension thickened as the judge slammed her gavel, the sound sharp and final. "This court will not tolerate lies," she declared, her voice breaking with emotion. Yet beneath Jimmy's calm exterior, there was a story untold. His eyes, though clouded by time, held a flicker of pain, memories of war, of comrades lost, of a life rebuilt from ashes. The medal in his hand wasn't just a decoration. It was a lifeline to a past he'd carried silently for decades. The crowd's whispers grew a mix of sympathy and curiosity as they wondered what had brought this gentle old man to such a confrontation. The judge, sensing the room's unrest, paused, her chest heaving. "We'll take a recess," she announced abruptly, her tone laced with uncertainty. As she retreated to her chambers, the air hung heavy with the promise of a truth about to surface, leaving the listeners on the edge of their seats. The gavel's echo still lingered in the air as the courtroom emptied for the recess, the soft shuffle of footsteps fading into the June morning outside. Judge Margaret Hayes had retreated to her chambers, her furious outburst replaying in her mind, while James "Jimmy" Carter remained seated, his frail hands still clutching the tarnished Purple Heart. The crowd, a gathering of retirees with stories etched into their faces, dispersed with hushed whispers, their hearts stirred by the confrontation they'd witnessed. Many felt a pull toward Jimmy. His quiet dignity reminded them of fathers, uncles, or husbands who'd returned from war with scars no one could see. The tension from the judge's accusation hung like a storm cloud, but beneath it a deeper story was beginning to stir. Jimmy's life had been forged in the crucible of World War II, a young man of 19 when he stormed the beaches of Normandy in 1944. The salt air, the roar of gunfire, the cries of fallen comrades, it all flooded back as he sat there, his memory a fragile bridge to those days. He'd carried a wounded soldier to safety under heavy fire, an act of bravery that earned him the Purple Heart, and a commendation he never spoke of. The war left him with shrapnel in his leg, and a silence that settled deep in his soul, a silence his young wife Elsie had tried to fill with love. But the nightmares stole her patience, and after she passed from illness, Jimmy raised their two children alone, working long hours as a carpenter to keep them fed. Those years were hard marked by the creak of his old truck and the weight of unpaid bills, but Jimmy never complained. The veteran's benefits he received were modest, a lifeline he'd earned through blood and sacrifice, though the paperwork had been lost in the chaos of post-war bureaucracy. Now at 92, with his children grown and his health fading, he relied on those checks to afford his small apartment and the roses he tended in memory of Elsie. The accusation of fraud stung not because of the money, but because it tarnished the honor he'd carried silently for decades. As he sat, his fingers traced the metal's edges, a tear slipping down his cheek unseen by the departing crowd. During the recess, a visitor approached Tom, a fellow veteran from his unit, now bent with age but with eyes that sparkled with recognition. "Jimmy Carter." Tom rasped, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought I'd never see you again." They embraced, frail arms holding tight, and Tom revealed a faded photo of their squad, Jimmy's young face beaming amidst the mud and fear. "You saved my life that day," Tom said, his voice breaking. "That medal's yours, fair and square." The revelation stirred Jimmy's heart, a flicker of pride amid the shame of the courtroom. The crowd, overhearing, began to murmur with renewed sympathy, sensing the truth was more complex than the judge's rage suggested. As the recess neared its end, Jimmy handed Tom the photo, a silent promise to reconnect, setting the stage for a truth that would soon challenge the courtroom's judgment. The recess stretched on the courthouse clock, ticking toward noon, as the warm June sun filtered through the windows, casting a soft glow over the emptying courtroom. The earlier storm of Judge Margaret Hayes' furious accusation still echoed in the minds of those who lingered, her pointed finger at James "Jimmy" Carter, an image that refused to fade. Jimmy sat quietly, his weathered hands now resting on the Purple Heart, the visit from Tom, his old comrade, having rekindled a spark of pride amid the shame. The crowd, a mix of retirees with knowing eyes, murmured among themselves, their sympathy for the veteran growing as whispers of his Normandy heroics spread. The tension from Margaret's outburst had left a crack in the proceedings, and that crack was about to widen. Margaret Hayes retreated to her chambers, the weight of her actions pressing down on her. At 68, she carried a legacy of justice tempered by personal loss, her father a soldier killed in Korea, whose absence had shaped her distrust of those she suspected of exploiting the system. The fraud case against Jimmy had seemed clear-cut. At first, records showed discrepancies in his benefits. Claims suggesting he'd lived beyond the age documented a mistake that fueled her rage. But as she reviewed the file, her hands trembled. The error wasn't Jimmy's, it was hers. She'd confused his case with another, a known scammer, and her personal bias had blinded her. The realization hit like a punch, her breath catching as she stared at the photo Tom had left with the clerk, a young Jimmy cradling a wounded soldier, a face hauntingly familiar. Back in the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted as the recess ended. Margaret returned, her face pale but composed, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. The crowd noticed their whispers growing louder, a retired sergeant among them muttering, "She's got no right to judge him like that." Jimmy's presence, his medals glinting, his silence steadfast, began to sway opinions. A woman with silver hair leaned forward, recalling her brother's return from Vietnam, and whispered, "He's one of us." The judge's mistake was becoming a collective wound felt by those who lived through war's aftermath. Then a new voice broke the tension. Clara, a retired military clerk in her 70s, shuffled forward with a stack of yellow documents. "Your Honor," she said, her voice quivering but firm, "these are Jimmy's original discharge papers. He was denied full benefits due to a clerical error in 46. The room stilled all eyes on the papers as Clara continued. He's been living on scraps of what he earned. Margaret's face flushed her earlier rage, now a bitter taste. She'd pointed at him in anger, a mistake born of her own pain, and now the truth stared back. The crowd's murmurs turned to soft applause, a tribute to Jimmy's endurance. As Margaret struggled to respond, the weight of her error loomed large, promising a reckoning that would test her integrity. The courtroom fell into a reverent hush as Clara's words hung in the air, the yellow discharge papers trembling slightly in her aged hands. The soft June sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the faces of the retirees who filled the benches, their eyes glistening with a mix of awe and empathy. Judge Margaret Hayes stood frozen, her earlier fury replaced by a flush of shame as she stared at the documents proving Jimmy Carter's innocence. Jimmy himself remained seated, his frail figure draped in that faded army uniform, the Purple Heart glinting softly against his chest. The crowd's earlier murmurs had swelled into a quiet applause, a tribute to a man they now saw as a victim of a system and a judge's misjudgment. Clara, the retired military clerk, stepped closer to the bench, her voice steady despite the years. These papers show Jimmy was discharged in 45, she explained, pointing to the faded ink. But the benefits office lost his file, and he was only granted a fraction of what he deserved. He never complained, he just kept going. The revelation struck the room like a gentle wave, stirring memories among the listeners of friends and family who'd faced similar injustices after the war. Margaret's hands tightened on the gavel, her mind racing back to the photo Tom had left, a young Jimmy cradling a wounded soldier, a face that now haunted her with recognition. Jimmy rose slowly, his legs shaky, but his voice clear as he began to speak. "I was 19 on Normandy," he said, his gaze distant. "Saved a fella under fire, didn't think much of it. He was bleeding bad, and I just carried him. Turns out that was your father, ma'am." The room gasped, eyes darting to Margaret, whose face paled. Her father, lost in Korea, had a brother who'd fought in WWII, a brother she'd never known well. The coincidence was staggering, and Jimmy's words unraveled a thread of her own history she'd buried deep. "I never took credit," he continued, his voice breaking. "Just wanted to live quiet." The crowd leaned in tears, welling in the eyes of a man with a veteran's cap who murmured, "That's the greatest generation right there." Margaret's internal conflict deepened. Her rage had been misdirected, fueled by a personal wound, now mirrored in Jimmy's sacrifice. She wanted to dismiss it, to cling to her authority, but the weight of the truth pressed down. Clara handed over additional records confirming Jimmy's modest claims and the government's error, leaving no room for doubt. The judge's silence stretched her chest tight with regret as the room waited for her response. For these older listeners, it was a moment of raw emotion, a bridge between past sacrifices and present justice, teetering on the edge of a turning point. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as the clock ticked toward 11:55 a.m. on this warm Thursday, June 12th, 2025, the soft hum of the air conditioning blending with the tension that filled the room. The revelation of Jimmy Carter's heroic past and the judge's personal connection to it lingered like a gentle mist, softening the earlier storm of Margaret Hayes's rage. Jimmy sat with his head slightly bowed, the Purple Heart resting against his chest, his misty eyes reflecting a lifetime of quiet endurance. The crowd, a sea of retirees with weathered faces, watched in silence, their hearts stirred by the truth that had unraveled, truth that now rested heavily on the judge's shoulders. Margaret stood behind the bench, her black robe a stark contrast to the flush creeping up her neck. The documents before her, Clara's yellowed records and the photo of her uncle saved by Jimmy's bravery, told a story she could no longer ignore. Her chest tightened as she recalled her father's letters, the pride in his brother's service, and the bitterness she'd carried since his death in Korea. That bitterness had fueled her outburst, her finger pointing at Jimmy in a moment of blind fury. Now the weight of her mistake pressed down, and the room's expectant gaze only deepened her resolve. She cleared her throat, her voice trembling, as she began. "Mr. Carter, I owe you an apology." The crowd gasped softly, a ripple of emotion passing through them. Margaret's words were halting, raw with regret. "I misjudged you," she continued, her eyes meeting Jimmy's. "My anger came from a place of loss, my father, my uncle's shadow. But you saved him, and I accused you without cause." Tears glistened in her eyes as she stepped from the bench, a rare move that stunned the room. Approaching Jimmy, she extended a hand, her voice breaking. "Thank you, for him, for all of us." Jimmy rose, his frail hand grasping hers, a tear tracing down his cheek as he whispered, "No need, ma'am. Just glad it's clear now." Then came the unexpected. Margaret turned to the court, her voice steadying with purpose. "This case exposes a flaw not just in my judgment, but in our system. I will request a full review of all veterans' records to correct these errors." The room erupted in applause, a standing ovation from the retirees who'd lived through the aftermath of war, their claps a thunder of approval. Jimmy smiled, weakly overwhelmed, as a bailiff handed him a letter from the Department of Defense, promising a formal recognition of his service. The judge's mistake had become a catalyst, a moment of redemption that left the crowd teary-eyed and hopeful. For these listeners, it was a triumph of humanity, a story of forgiveness unfolding in real time. The courtroom buzzed with a warm, emotional hum as the clock struck noon on that transformative Thursday, June 12, 2025, the June sunlight pouring through the windows to bathe the room in a golden glow. The standing ovation for Judge Margaret Hayes' apology and her bold promise to review veterans' records still lingered, a testament to the power of the moment that had just unfolded. James Jimmy Carter sat with a faint smile, the letter from the Department of Defense trembling in his hands, his purple heart glinting as a symbol of an honor long overdue. The crowd, a tapestry of retirees with tear-streaked faces, began to settle, their hearts full from witnessing a rare act of redemption and justice. A few days later, Margaret found herself driving to Jimmy's modest home on the outskirts of town, a small bungalow surrounded by rose bushes that nodded in the breeze. The weight of her mistake had lifted, slightly replaced by a desire to make amends. She carried a polished new medal, a replacement for the one worn by time, and a folder of documents to ensure his benefits were restored. Knocking on the door, she was greeted by Jimmy's gentle voice. "Come in, Judge." Inside, the air smelled of tea and old wood, and Jimmy sat in a rocking chair, his uniform replaced by a simple sweater. They sat together, and Margaret handed him the medal, her voice soft. "This is for you and for my uncle." Their conversation wove through memories, Jimmy recounting the muddy fields of Normandy, Margaret sharing stories of her father's letters. Tears fell as she admitted, "I let my pain blind me. You've taught me to see differently." The town soon learned of their reconciliation, and a ceremony was planned. On a crisp Saturday, veterans and families gathered, flags waving, as Jimmy was honored with a plaque, "James Carter, Hero of Silence." Margaret spoke, her voice steady. "This man's sacrifice reminds us to heal, not judge." The crowd cheered, clapping hands gnarled by time, their applause a bridge between generations. For Jimmy, the recognition brought peace. That night he sat with his grandson, sharing tales of comrades, lost, his voice fading as he spoke of a dream to meet them again. The community's embrace, sparked by Margaret's change of heart, became a beacon of hope. For the older listeners tuning in, it was a story of forgiveness and community, a balm for wounds carried since the war, leaving them with a sense of warmth and closure as the tale neared its end. The soft chime of the town's church bell rang out at 11:56 a.m. on Thursday, June 12, 2025, as the story of James Jimmy Carter and Judge Margaret Hayes settled into the hearts of those who'd followed it. The ceremony honoring Jimmy had left a lasting mark on the small community, the plaque gleaming under the morning sun etched with James Carter, hero of silence. The roses around his bungalow swayed gently, a quiet tribute to the life he'd lived with dignity. Margaret's visit and the restored benefits had brought a semblance of peace, but the tale was far from over. Its legacy would endure beyond Jimmy's days. Months later, Jimmy passed quietly in his sleep, his grandson by his side, the new medal resting on his chest. The town mourned, but there was no bitterness, only gratitude for a man who'd carried his burdens with grace. A statue was erected in the town square, a bronze figure of Jimmy in his uniform, his hand raised in salute, a symbol of the silent heroes of their generation. At the unveiling, Margaret stood before the crowd, her voice thick with emotion. "Jimmy taught me that justice isn't just about rules. It's about seeing the heart," she said, her eyes tracing the statue. "His story changed me, and it should change us all." The retirees who'd filled the courtroom that day gathered again, their faces lined with memories of their own wars: World War II, Korea, Vietnam. They shared stories of lost friends, of letters never answered, and found solace in Jimmy's journey. Margaret, now a quieter figure, spent her retirement advocating for veterans' rights, her desk piled with files to correct the system's errors. The sound of the church bell, a steady rhythm, underscored her final reflection. "We owe them more than medals, we owe them understanding." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the statue, the audio faded with the distant toll of the bell, a call to remember. For the older listeners, it was a closing chapter that stirred their souls, a reminder of sacrifice and the power of redemption. Jimmy's dream of reuniting with his comrades seemed fulfilled in the love of the town he left behind. The story ended not with sorrow, but with a quiet hope, inviting them to share their own tales of resilience.